Chapter 13, Digging for Treasures. This story is an excerpt from the novel Treasure Seekers. Let us read. Well, when we had agreed to dig for treasure, we all went down into the cellar and lighted the gas. Oswald would have liked to dig there, but it was stone flags. We looked around among the old boxes and broken chairs and fenders and empty bottles and things, and at last we found the spades we had to dig in the sand with when we went to the seaside 3 years ago. They are not silly, babyish wooden spades that split if you look at them, but good iron with a blue mark across the top of the iron part and yellow wooden handles. In this part of the story, the children, including Oswald, that is the main character here, whose house in his house in the cellar, that is the storeroom, the children go to look for spades, and they find spades to dig which they had used 3 years ago to go on the seaside and dig and play. Same ones they found, which were not very kiddish or babyish spades. They were good quality, made of good iron spades, which they wanted to use to dig the treasure in the garden. It was no use doing the thing by halves. We marked out a sort of square in the moldy part of the garden, about 3 yards across, and began to dig. But we found nothing except worms and stones, and the ground was very hard. The children, they decided to work together, and when they were digging in a part of the garden, they only found worms and stones and no treasure. So they decided to dig in another place. So we thought we'd try another part of the garden, and we found a place in the big round flower bed where the ground was much softer. We thought we'd make a smaller hole to begin with, and it was much better. We dug and dug and dug, and it was jolly hard work. That means it was quite a hard work. We got very hot digging, but we found nothing. That means they got very tired and were sweating while digging, but even then they could not find anything. Presently, Albert next door looked over the wall. Now there was another friend of theirs, neighbor, whose name was Albert. So next door, because he was living just next to Oswald's house, he was looking over the wall. We do not like him very much, but we let him play with us sometimes, because his father is dead, and you must not be unkind to orphans, even if their mothers are alive. Albert is always very tidy. So Oswald goes on to tell about Albert, that he has no father. Although his mother is alive, he says that they don't like him much, but even then they are kind to him and let him play with them. He says that he is very tidy. So we said hello, and he said, "What are you up to?" "We are digging for treasure," said Alice, one of the children there. An ancient parchment revealed to us the place of concealment. That is, an ancient parchment. Parchment is a very light skin paper-like skin of animal on which it was written in ancient times. And that is what revealed. It showed the place of treasure, which was kept in concealment, that is in hiding. "Come over and help us. When we have dug deep enough, we shall find great pot of red clay, full of gold and precious jewels. So they call Albert over, they tell him to help them to dig the ground, because the parchment paper in which the message is written where the treasure is, it says that they will find the treasure under the ground in the garden, and it will be full of gold, jewels and precious jewels and stones. Albert next door only sniggered and said, "What silly nonsense." That means Albert next door, he laughed at them and said, "What silly nonsense" to them. He cannot play properly at all. It is very strange because he has very nice uncle. See, Albert next door doesn't care for reading, and he has not read nearly so many books as we have. So he is very foolish and ignorant, but it cannot be helped, and you just have to put up with it when you want him to do anything. Now Oswald goes on to tell us that Albert is a little strange type of a person, and because although his uncle with whom he stays is very nice, but Albert doesn't even read, so he is very foolish and ignorant, because if you read you get knowledge. So he says he is very foolish, but even then we have to put up with him if you want him to do some work. Besides, it is wrong to be angry with people for not being so clever as you are yourself. It is not always their fault. He says that it's not their fault actually. It is not necessary that everyone has to be clever like you, so you shouldn't be angry with them. So Oswald said, "Come and dig, then you shall share the treasure when we found it." Oswald still calls him to dig, but he said, "I shan't. I don't like digging, and I'm just going in to my tea." He says, "I don't like digging." Albert says, "I don't like digging. I'm not coming. I'm going to have my tea." "Come along and dig. There's a good boy," Alice said. "You can use my spade. It's moreover the best." She says, "The spade which I'm using is very good. You use it." Okay. And she calls him. So he came along and dug, and when once he was over the wall, we kept him at it, and we worked as well, of course, and the hole got deeper. Pincher worked too. Now Pincher is their dog, their pet dog. So Albert came over to help finally. Pincher worked too. He is our dog, and he is very good at digging. He digs for rats in the dustbin sometimes and gets very dirty. But we love our dog, even when his face wants washing. That means even if he is very dirty, we still love him. I expect we shall have to make a tunnel, Oswald said. He said maybe we'll need to make a tunnel to reach the rich treasure. So he jumped into the hole and began to dig at one side. After that, we took it in turns to dig at the tunnel. So one by one, they were taking turns to dig the tunnel. And Pincher was most useful in scraping the earth out of the tunnel. And what was Pincher doing? He was removing the mud that was collected out of the tunnel. He was removing that. He does it with his back feet when you say rats. They say that whenever you tell him rats, he starts to dig. And he digs with his front ones and burrows with his nose as well. So all that Pincher would do. At last the tunnel was nearly a yard long and big enough to creep along to find the treasure. So tunnel was so big now that now they could almost a yard long, so that they could just crawl into it to find the treasure. If only it had been a bit longer. It had to be a little longer, but now it was Albert's turn to dig in and dig, to get in and dig. But he funked it. That means he refused to go inside. "Take your turn," said Oswald, but Albert wouldn't. So we had to make him, because it was only fair. "It's quite easy," Alice said. "You just crawl in and dig with your hands," Alice was telling Albert. "Then, when you come out, we can scrape out what you've done with the spades. You won't notice it being dark in the tunnel if you shut your eyes tight. We'll all been except Dora, and she doesn't like worms." So Dora is one of the girls there who doesn't like worms. That's why she's not been inside the tunnel. "I don't like worms neither." Albert next door said this, but we remembered how he had picked up a fat red and black worm up in his fingers and thrown it at Dora only a day before, so we put him in. As Albert also gave the excuse that he didn't like worms, but they didn't listen to him, because the day before only he had thrown a worm at Dora. So they put him inside the tunnel. But he would not go in head first, the proper way, and dig with his hands as we had done. And though Oswald was angry at that time, for he hated snivellers, yet afterwards he owned that perhaps it was just as well. So Albert was refusing to go in, but he didn't like people, because Oswald didn't like people who complain. But even then he had to bear with him and let him go feet first, rather than going head first as everyone else had done. You should never be afraid to own that perhaps you were mistaken, but it is cowardly to do it unless you are quite sure you are in the wrong. So that is why no one said anything to him. "Let me go in feet first," said Albert next door. "I'll dig with my boots. I will truly honor right." Albert said he would dig with his foot, the boots which he was wearing. No one wanted to believe it, but he tried to convince them, saying that he would do as he is saying. So we let him get in feet first, and he did it very slowly, and at last he was in, and only his head sticking out into the hole, and all the rest of him was in the tunnel. "Now dig with your boots," said Oswald, "and Alice, do catch hold of Pincher. He'll be digging again in another minute, and perhaps it would be uncomfortable for Albert if Pincher threw the mold into his eyes." So Oswald told Alice to hold Pincher, because Pincher would also start digging, and since Albert's head was up out of the hole, the mud would go into his eyes. So he told Alice to hold Pincher. "You should always try to think of these little things. Thinking of other people's comfort makes them like you." That is what Oswald is saying. That he was trying to think of Pincher not getting the mud into Albert's eyes. So he was trying to think of him. So it is a good thing to do that. Then people liked you. Alice held Pincher, and we all shouted, "Kick! Dig with your feet for all you're worth," they're telling Albert. So Albert next door began to dig with his feet, and we stood on the ground over him waiting, and all in a minute the ground gave way, and we tumbled together in a heap. So as he was digging the tunnel so deep, he dug nicely that the whole ground came down came down and all of them fell inside the tunnel. And when we got up, there was a little shallow hollow where we had been standing, and Albert next door was under them, stuck quite fast because the roof of the tunnel had tumbled in on him. He is a horribly unlucky boy to have anything to do with. So finally, they blame it on Albert, saying that he was really very unlucky and they did not find any treasure there also. That's the story.